of New York Bay, called South Cove or Communipaw Bay, reached up to what became Phillip Street, just east of Central Railroad of New Jersey tracks along the waterfront. Communipaw Bay was filled in by the railroads in the late 1800s. All was well for 9 years until the next Director General, William Kieft, embroiled New Netherland in Indian warfare that nearly dismantled the colony. Soon after his arrival in September 1639, Kieft leveled attacks on the Indians living in all of New Netherland, and in 1641 Kieft tried to avenge the deaths of a few Dutch settlers by local Indians in a retaliatory strike which would later be dubbed Kieft's War. On the night of February 25, 1643, Kieft ordered an attack on the Indians at Pavonia. Though he told his soldiers to spare the women and children, they ignored his orders and killed 80 Indian men, women, and children. 11 Indian tribes who had previously been at odds with each other united to drive out the Dutch. Most Dutch colonists were either killed or captured. Those who were fortunate escaped to New Amsterdam, where they could watch their homes and their crops burn from across the river. Pavonia was destroyed. Peace did not return to the area until a ceasefire agreement ended the hostilities in August 1645. Settlers in the colony asked the Dutch West India Company to recall Kieft to Holland for an investigation, and the hostilities convinced many settlers to return home to Europe. The Dutch experiment in the New World was teetering on the brink of collapse. In 1646, hoping to restore order and profitability to the colony, the Dutch West India Company appointed Peter Stuyvesant Director General of New Netherland. A former soldier, he had served as governor of the Dutch Caribbean island of Curaçao, where he lost his right leg fighting the Spanish. The injury forced him to wear a wooden stick as an artificial limb, leaving him with the unfortunate nickname Peg Leg Pete. Many believe that the uncomfortable prosthesis may have been the reason for his reputed nasty demeanor and autocratic style. But however unpleasant and dictatorial he may have been, he was at the very least practical and learned a great deal about what not to do from his predecessor. Stuyvesant adopting a more conciliatory tone with the Indians, and the colony flourished. New settlers arrived, and it looked as though Stuyvesant was achieving the objectives he was chosen to do: bring about peace and prosperity in New Netherlands. But it wasn't long before he was tested. On September 15, 1655, in what became known as the Peachtree War, the colony was almost destroyed a second time. It began when a young Indian girl entered the orchard of Henry Van Dyke on Manhattan Island and picked a peach from a tree. Incensed, Van Dyke shot her, killing her instantly. Unfortunately for the Dutch, Stuyvesant and the entire Dutch Defense Force had left the colony days earlier, headed for the Delaware Valley. Taking advantage of his absence, 500 Indians swept through Hoboken, Livonia, and Staten Island, killing over 100 colonists and capturing 100 more. On his return to New Amsterdam, Stuyvesant faced a grave situation, but he successfully negotiated with the Indians and bargained for the release of the captives who were being held at Paul's Hook. Ultimately, the captives were returned for a ransom of gunpowder and lead. Following this last Indian crisis, Stuyvesant realized that the settlers at Pavonia needed to establish a fortified town for defense rather than return to live on their isolated estates along the Hudson River. With this in mind, and as part of the peace negotiations, on January 30th, 1658, Stuyvesant met with local Indian chiefs at Fort Amsterdam for the repurchase of the Western Shore. It included all the lands between the Hackensack and north, the Hudson River, from Weehawken and Secaucus to the Kilvan Kull. At his request, the Council of New Amsterdam approved a hilltop site for a garrison-style town or village. Settlers from the colony were invited to move to the fort and live behind the square wooden palisade where they could defend themselves with a militia against the Indians. The site chosen was a former cornfield cleared by the Indians on the Heights, approximately 2 miles from the Hudson River, and was named Bergen, the Dutch word for hill. Settlers built homes on lots within the fort and established farms outside its walls, creating a defensive zone against the Indians. Stuyvesant then signed a peace treaty with the Indians on March 6, 1660, making the Peachtree War the last major Dutch-Indian hostility in New Netherland. On September 5, 1661, Stuyvesant issued a charter of incorporation to the village of Bergen that included a court of justice, a church, and a school. That same year, he granted Bergen limited powers of self-government and a court of inferior justice. Members of the Dutch Reformed Church, now the Old Bergen Church, began the establishment of a permanent meeting place, and the colony's first elementary school was built. The village stretched from what is now Broome Street on the south to Newkirk Street on the north, and from Tours Avenue on the east to Van Ryckman Street on the west, with a tall log stockade built around it. What is now Bergen Avenue was the road that ran through its center, with gates and blockhouses at either end. A public square was laid out in its center, now Bergen Square. A well in the middle was the town's first waterworks. Soon afterwards, another settlement sprang up again at Communipaw, stretching along Phillip Street, but it came under the government of Bergen. Its inhabitants reached Bergen by Jersey City's first road, which followed the present line of Communipaw Avenue up to what is now Summit Avenue, and up to Academy Street, which led to the schoolhouse at Bergen Square, giving Academy Street its name. Little did those settlers know that their village would exist only 3 more years as a Dutch colony. While Stuyvesant was busy organizing the new village at Bergen, English King Charles II and his brother James, the Duke of York, were plotting to solidify their control of the northeast coast of America. The Duke of York commissioned Colonel Richard Nichols with 4 ships and 400 soldiers to take over New Netherlands. On August 27, 1664, the English fleet arrived in the New Amsterdam's harbor. Nichols demanded that the colony surrender. Stuyvesant, old soldier that he was, tried to rally support among the settlers to defend the colony. Rather, the settlers and his council advised him to surrender. After a week of deliberating, Stuyvesant surrendered it to the English on September 8, 1664. Without firing a shot, New Amsterdam ceased to exist. James, the Duke of York, renamed the colony after his dukedom. It became New York. But the English were benevolent conquerors. The settlers could keep their property, had religious freedom, and the English continued to trade with the Dutch. These conditions allowed the Dutch to retain their ethnic culture in the New World, and for decades, the Dutch retained a separatist nature. Reminders of this community's Dutch past are all around in street names like Sip and Bergen, words like stoop and pancake, and of course in plays like The Legend of Communipaw. No, you're testing the motion.